There's a bridge in northern Russia that doesn't appear in any modern engineering textbook. Officially, it was built in 1904. The problem is the architectural analysis suggests it couldn't have been. The load calculations, the material composition, the construction techniques all point to something far more sophisticated than anything documented from that era. And when you start looking for similar structures across Central Asia, you find dozens more. Bridges that official history can't quite explain, built with precision that seems impossible for their supposed construction dates, then systematically removed from academic discussion. The official story tells us these are simply old bridges, remnants of imperial Russian expansion, products of European engineering excellence spreading eastward. But that explanation starts to collapse when you examine what's actually still standing. Because these aren't crude frontier constructions. They're masterworks of engineering that shouldn't exist according to our accepted timeline of technological development. In 1891, engineers surveying trade routes through Siberia documented a stone arch bridge spanning the Yenisei River. The structure measured 400 feet across a single span. No support columns, no visible reinforcement, just a perfectly curved arch of stone blocks fitted so precisely that you couldn't slide paper between them. The survey notes described it as ancient, already weathered, already integrated into the landscape, as if it had been there for centuries. Yet there's no record of who built it. Russian imperial archives mention its existence but provide no construction documentation, no engineering plans, no explanation for how such a massive single span could have been achieved without modern materials or methods. That bridge was demolished in 1932. The official reason was infrastructure modernization. The actual reason remains unclear because the replacement structure was significantly less impressive, requiring multiple support columns and modern steel reinforcement to achieve a span barely half as long. This pattern repeats across the former territories, marked as Tartaria on maps from the 1700s. Bridges that were too sophisticated, documented briefly, then destroyed or buried in official records that became increasingly vague about their origins. By the mid-1800s, European explorers travelling through Central Asia routinely encountered stone bridges of extraordinary engineering, crossing gorges and rivers that modern construction still finds challenging. Their reports describe structures built without mortar, relying entirely on precise stone cutting and gravitational lock. Some bridges incorporated drainage systems that prevented water damage. Others featured expansion joints that accommodated temperature changes, technical solutions that supposedly weren't invented until much later. The most disturbing detail isn't the bridges themselves, it's what happened to the documentation. Early survey maps from the 1600s and 1700s show extensive bridge networks throughout the region. Trading companies marked them carefully because these structures were critical for commerce. French cartographers, Dutch merchants, British explorers, all independently documented the same infrastructure. Then over the course of the 1800s, the bridges started disappearing from maps, not the physical structures necessarily, but the acknowledgement of their existence, their sophistication, their origin. Take the Karakum Bridge Network. Maps from 1720 show at least 15 major stone bridges crossing rivers and wadis in what's now Turkmenistan. Each bridge is marked with symbols indicating permanent construction, suitable for heavy cart traffic. By 1850, those same routes show only 3 bridges, and those are labelled as recent construction by Russian engineers. What happened to the other 12? Some were presumably destroyed by weather or conflict, but several were photographed as late as 1880, still standing, still functional, still demonstrating engineering principles that conventional history claims weren't understood in that region until European contact. One photograph in particular troubles anyone who examines it closely. Taken in 1883 near Samarkand, it shows a triple-arch bridge with each span measuring approximately 60 feet. The stone blocks are massive, weighing several tons each, fitted without visible mortar. The precision is extraordinary. Modern engineers who've analysed the image point out that achieving those tolerances requires advanced surveying equipment, sophisticated understanding of load distribution, and construction techniques that don't match anything from Central Asian history as we're taught it. The bridge appears in that single photograph, then vanishes from all subsequent records. No demolition documentation, no mention in later surveys, no explanation for why such an impressive structure would simply cease to exist in official history. When you map all the documented bridges that disappeared from records between 1800 and 1900, a pattern emerges. They cluster in regions that old maps labelled as Tartarian territory. They demonstrate engineering sophistication that exceeds what we're told those regions possessed. And they all share similar construction methods, specific architectural features, particular approaches to spanning large distances with stone. It's as if there was a common engineering tradition, a shared technical knowledge that produced infrastructure across thousands of miles. But here's what makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The bridges that survived, the ones that weren't demolished or buried in bureaucratic silence, they present problems for the official timeline. Because when modern engineering teams analyse them, when they measure the precision, when they calculate the loads and stresses and material properties, the conclusion is always the same. These structures demonstrate knowledge that shouldn't have existed in those locations at those times. And that raises a question no one seems willing to answer directly. Who built them? The official answer comes from the Russian Empire itself. According to records, these bridges were constructed by local populations under Russian supervision after the region was incorporated into the empire. Except the bridges photographed in the 1880s already showed weathering patterns consistent with centuries of exposure. Stone doesn't lie about its age the way documents can. When geologists examined images of the Samarkand Bridge, they noted erosion characteristics that typically require 400 to 600 years to develop in that climate. Yet Russia only claimed control of that territory in the 1860s. The math doesn't work. But there's something else in those photographs that nobody discusses: the workers. In several images from Central Asian construction projects in the 1870s and 1880s, you can see labourers standing next to these ancient bridges. They're not building them, they're repairing them, patching sections, reinforcing foundations, maintaining infrastructure they clearly didn't create. One photograph from 1879 shows a Russian engineering team inspecting a bridge near Bukhara. The bridge itself demonstrates construction techniques that wouldn't appear in Russian engineering manuals for another 2 decades. Yet there they are, measuring it, documenting it, trying to understand how it was built. The caption in the archive simply reads, "Pre-existing structure, origin unknown, maintenance required." That phrase appears repeatedly in Russian colonial records from Central Asia. Pre-existing structure, as if massive stone bridges capable of supporting modern cart traffic just materialized from nowhere. As if the engineering knowledge required to build them was irrelevant to the historical record. What's particularly interesting is what happened to these bridges after they were documented. Many were deliberately destroyed. Not by weather, not by war, by administrative decision. Russian military records from the 1890s contain orders to dismantle specific bridges and replace them with new construction. The justification: modernization, improvement of trade routes, integration into the imperial infrastructure system. But when you examine what replaced these bridges, you find something bizarre. The new Russian bridges were often less sophisticated. They used simpler construction methods. They spanned shorter distances. They required more frequent maintenance. It's as if the goal wasn't improvement, it was replacement, erasing evidence of what came before by literally building over it with something demonstrably inferior. This pattern repeats across former Tartarian territories. Old bridge demolished, new bridge built, historical record adjusted. Within a generation, locals forgot that their grandparents had used different bridges entirely. The new structures became the old structures in collective memory, and the photographs that documented the original bridges, they ended up scattered across private collections, filed in archives under vague classifications, or simply disappeared. When I started mapping the locations of these vanished bridges, something became clear. They formed a network. Not random crossing points, but an organised transportation system connecting population centres across thousands of miles. The kind of infrastructure that requires central planning, coordinated construction, shared engineering standards. The kind of infrastructure that belongs to a large, organised civilization. Consider what this network represents. To build bridges at this scale, you need quarries, you need stonemasons, you need metallurgical knowledge for tools, you need mathematical understanding for the engineering calculations. You need a society capable of mobilizing massive resources over extended periods. Most importantly, you need a reason. Bridges don't appear randomly. They're built to connect places that matter: cities, trade centers, administrative hubs. So where are those places now? Some became modern cities with completely rewritten foundation dates. Others vanished entirely. Their locations marked only by unusual ruins that conventional archaeology struggles to explain. A few survived as archaeological sites that don't quite fit the accepted timeline. But the bridges remain the key because they're harder to explain away. You can't claim a 60-foot stone arch bridge is a natural formation. You can't argue it was built by nomadic tribes. You can't dismiss it as ceremonial or decorative. A bridge has one purpose: moving people and goods across obstacles, which means the civilization that built these bridges had people to move and goods to transport. It means they had an economy, a society, organised human activity at scale. Everything the official history claims didn't exist in those regions until European contact. There's a photograph I keep returning to, taken in 1891, location labelled only as Turkestan province. It shows a stone bridge, 3 arches, crossing a river that's nearly dry in the image. The bridge is massive, over-engineered for the small stream visible below it. But here's what catches your attention. The riverbed. It's been excavated around the bridge foundations, exposing the base stones. And those foundations go down at least 20 feet below the current river level. 20 feet. That's not a foundation built for the river, visible in the photograph. That's a foundation built for a much larger waterway. Either the river was dramatically bigger when the bridge was constructed, or the entire landscape has changed since then. How long does it take for a major river to shrink to a stream? Centuries at minimum, possibly millennia. Yet according to official records, that bridge was supposedly built within living memory of when the photograph was taken. The timeline collapses under the slightest scrutiny. And that's before you consider the engineering. Those foundations weren't just deep, they were precise. Cut stone blocks fitted together with tolerances that modern construction would struggle to match. No mortar, no concrete, just gravity and geometry, holding tons of stone in perfect position. This is knowledge you don't improvise. This is knowledge you inherit, refined, passed down through generations of builders who understand exactly what they're doing. So who taught them? The official records don't answer that question because they can't. Acknowledging transmitted knowledge means acknowledging a source, a civilization capable of training engineers across vast distances, maintaining construction standards, preserving techniques through generations. The kind of civilization that leaves bridges behind as proof of its existence. What happened to it? The standard explanation points to the Mongol invasions, destruction, chaos, the collapse of trade routes. But here's what doesn't fit. The Mongols were empire builders, not destroyers of infrastructure. They needed roads, bridges, functioning cities to move armies and collect tribute. Destroying transportation networks would have undermined their own power. Yet something caused a systematic break in continuity. Not just political change, but technological amnesia. The knowledge required to build these bridges didn't gradually decline. It vanished. One generation capable of precision stonework. the next building crude replacements, or nothing at all. Look at what came after. When Russian engineers pushed into Central Asia in the 1800s, they found bridges they couldn't replicate with their own technology, stone structures they could barely repair, let alone reconstruct. They documented them, photographed them, then watched them slowly collapse because maintaining them exceeded their capabilities. That's not the result of gradual decline. That's the result of catastrophic knowledge loss. Something severed the connection between builders and their craft so completely that within a few generations, the techniques became incomprehensible. The mudflood hypothesis offers one explanation. A global catastrophe that buried cities, destroyed infrastructure, killed populations on a scale that broke cultural continuity. When survivors emerged, they no longer remembered how to build what their ancestors had built. They adapted, improvised, built on top of ruins they couldn't understand. But there's another possibility that keeps surfacing in the documents: deliberate suppression. Not through destruction, but through rewriting. Take over the bridges, claim them as your own construction, backdate the engineering to fit your timeline, bury anything that contradicts the new narrative. The Romanovs did exactly this across Siberia. Structures clearly predating Russian expansion were credited to Russian engineers. Maps were redrawn, showing Russian settlements where previous maps showed Tartarian cities. Historical records were edited, destroyed, or archived so deeply they became functionally lost. Why control? If you inherit infrastructure you didn't build, your legitimacy depends on making people forget who did build it. Every bridge becomes proof of your engineering prowess. Every road validates your territorial claims. History becomes whatever serves power. The bridge network tells a different story though. It speaks to organisation that transcended the regional kingdoms and tribal territories that official history places in those regions. Coordinated construction across thousands of miles requires central authority, shared resources, unified vision. It requires exactly the kind of empire that Tartaria appears to have been before it was erased from maps. And here's what makes this impossible to dismiss. The bridges match, not stylistically, in superficial ways, but structurally, in their engineering solutions. The same approach to load distribution, the same understanding of material properties, the same mathematical principles governing their design. You can trace the knowledge system across continents. That's not independent development, that's transmission. A civilization teaching its methods, maintaining standards, ensuring quality across its territories. The kind of civilization that official history insists never existed in those regions until Europeans arrived to civilize them. But the bridges don't lie. They're physical evidence of sophistication that predates the accepted timeline by centuries, possibly millennia. And they're eroding now, collapsing into rivers, being dismantled for building materials, disappearing before anyone bothers to properly study them. I've watched this happen in real time through archived photographs. A bridge documented intact in 1890, partially collapsed by 1920, gone entirely by 1950. No preservation efforts, no archaeological investigation, just gradual erasure as if the evidence itself was inconvenient. Because it is inconvenient, every standing bridge asks questions that conventional history can't answer. Who had the resources to build at this scale? Where did they quarry the stone? How did they transport blocks weighing tons across difficult terrain? What mathematical knowledge guided the engineering? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're evidence gaps that should have sparked investigations decades ago. Instead, they sparked silence. The bridges were noted, catalogued, then forgotten, allowed to crumble while historians focused on narratives that didn't require explaining advanced engineering in supposedly primitive regions. The foundations going 20 feet below current water levels tell their own story. Rivers don't shrink that dramatically in human timescales. That's geological time, environmental change on a scale that suggests these bridges are far older than any official dating admits, which means the civilization that built them existed during a period when the landscape itself looked different. That's the real mystery, not just who built the bridges, but when. Because if the answer pushes back centuries or millennia beyond accepted timelines, then everything we think we know about human civilization in those regions collapses. The entire narrative of development, progress, cultural evolution, it all requires rewriting. And maybe that's why the bridges are allowed to fall. Maybe preserving them means preserving questions that are easier left unasked. Because once you acknowledge advanced engineering where it's not supposed to exist, you have to explain it. You have to account for knowledge that shouldn't be there, sophistication that contradicts established history. The bridges are disappearing now. Another decade or two, and most will be gone, reduced to rubble in riverbeds, their engineering secrets lost forever. What remains will be photographs and scattered documentation that future researchers will struggle to verify because the physical evidence will no longer exist. That's how history gets erased. Not through dramatic book burnings or explicit censorship, but through neglect, through allowing inconvenient evidence to crumble while directing attention elsewhere. The bridges stood for centuries, possibly millennia. They'll vanish within our lifetimes, and with them, the last physical proof of what came before. The question isn't whether these bridges existed. The photographs prove they did. The question is why we're allowing the last evidence of an advanced civilization to crumble into dust while pretending it was never there. Every collapsed arch, every demolished span, every bridge left to decay takes with it answers about who we actually are and what we've forgotten. The stones remember what the history books won't say.